Today we're painting some Nurgle Plague Marines, and first off I started with a black undercoat. Next I was using the Death Guard green, of which I applied 2 coats. It's worth taking your time to make sure you get into all the areas necessary. For the next coat I'm dry brushing with Nurgle green, and the reason I'm dry brushing is one, to pick out the edges, but also on even the flat areas I want to add a little bit of texture to the colour. But you'll notice I'm not trying to add too much in the way of highlights or shades into this miniature, and you'll see why a bit later on. Now for the flesh, I'm using Nurgle green again, only this time I'm not trying to dry brush it, I'm just trying to apply the paint onto the flesh areas, and this again will take 2 coats to get a good base coat. Afterwards I've applied a quick dry brush of Underhive Ash just to add a little bit of extra colour to it. But at this point you can see that the flesh and the armour areas are quite similar in colour, but there's a slight difference. Now for the cowl, this will require 2, maybe even 3 coats of Bugman's Glow for the first coat. Again, it's important to get those base colours to a nice solid colour before you start applying the next layers of coats over the top of them. And once those coats are dry, next I've applied a dry brush coat of Kheza's flesh onto the cowl, so it gives it a nice flesh coloured look. For these areas of the armour, I wanted to give them a nice rusty look, so I started off with Rhinox hide first. And once you're happy with the base coat, next I've used a weathering powder to give it a rusty effect, but I've applied some Lahmian medium with a very small amount of the weathering powder. For the areas of the chainmail and where you can see the dents inside the armour, I've more or less done the same as what I did with the other rust areas, only I've used a more orange type weathering powder, and this time instead of applying Lahmian medium I've applied water. The main reason for this is by using the water instead, it makes it a bit easier for the weathering powder to sink into the recesses of the chainmail. Going back to the darker weathering powder, only this time I've applied water again to it instead of the Lahmian medium, and the reason why I'm doing it this time is I'm applying it with the intention that I take it off afterwards. So once I've applied it to the various areas into the crevices of the armour mostly, afterwards I can get a cotton bud and wipe over it and remove any of the excess, so it just leaves it mostly into those crevices and cracks that you want to keep the weathering powder there. Now for the horns, I've done a previous video on horns where the horns will look somewhat different to these ones, but with these being Nurgle I wanted them to look less healthy. So I started off with Mechanica Standard Grey, and once I feel I'm happy with the base colour, I've used Underhive Ash to go over the grey, and this helps to make it look like they're not particularly healthy, but also the Underhive Ash helps to merge the grey somewhat in with the green, and therefore making it look like one thing's growing out of the other as opposed to them being 2 separate entities. Now for the purpose of making this video a little bit quicker, I've done a previous video in regards to different ways to paint rust, and that video will cover how I painted the sword. It will also cover how I've painted the brass areas. I've also got a separate video which shows how I painted the blight drone, and also a separate video for how I paint the cloak. And for those of you who are interested, there's also another video that covers how I do swamp bases. For the last part here, what you can see is I'm using Typhus Corrosion to cover a few areas where you can see some watermarks going down the armour. The main thing to consider when doing this is do your best to make sure you don't have perfectly straight lines, because when you have watermarks they don't go straight, they have a little bit of deviation. If you like the video, remember to like, share, and click on the button on the lower right hand side to subscribe.